Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural Faces of Agriculture and USDA, hosted by the USDA Office of Partnerships and Public Engagement. We will get started in just a few moments, but first let's go over some quick housekeeping notes. All participants will be placed on mute during the presentations. This presentation will be recorded and shared with participants afterwards. If you have any questions for today's speakers, please place your questions in the chat box and we will address them after each presentation. I want to take a quick moment to thank our speakers and participants for taking time out of your busy schedules to learn and grow. This speaker series is an opportunity for high school and college students to engage with USDA professionals, learning about their stories, career paths, and exciting projects and initiatives that they are currently working on. Without further delay, I will introduce our first speaker, Dr. Roberto Rodriguez from USDA APHIS PPQ.
Ya lo apreté. Quiero meterme la videollamada, pero no puedo.
Thank you for that introduction.
Hola, buenos días. Esta la
Dr. Rodriguez.
So let's go ahead and get started. So as was stated, my name is Dr. Roberto Rodriguez, and I work at the United States Department of Agriculture, Plant Protection and Quarantine, and specifically in a branch that we call Science and Technology. And my primary job title is Methods Development Engineer, but I end up doing quite a few other things. So as far as plant protection and quarantine, our primary modus operandi is to safeguard U.S. agriculture and natural resources. So that means working overseas, working at the border, and working within the borders in order to protect our American infrastructure from any potential threats, whether that be plant diseases, plant pests, insects, fungi, anything like that. And then specifically in science technology, what we're primarily doing is coming up with new methods, technologies, tools, in order to allow other people to more accurately do that job. So we come up with new ways of applying pesticides, diagnostic tests for detecting diseases, and then we turn those over to the people who are then going to use those at the borders, even when doing some of our surveys domestically. And so particularly for me, as I said, I'm a methods development engineer. So what I usually end up doing is any projects that need an engineer, I end up doing that. So that will end up being some parts of design work, so mechanical design, electrical designs, and different systems for aerial spray application or for dispersal of sterile insects. And then more than just designing, I also usually end up having to build these things. That'll involve having to mill things out of raw materials, 3D print out of different plastics, or solder together some new electronics. And then the fun part of the job is when I actually get to go out and test. And so my primary area of expertise for these are unmanned aircraft, which you probably know better as drones, as well as our manned aircraft, so typically either airplanes or helicopters. So essentially, if it flies, I work on it. And so I thought I'd talk to you guys about two of the projects that I'm primarily working on. And so one of those involves something called Mexican fruit fly. And this is a particular pest for citrus, so oranges, grapefruit, mango, but it can also kind of wreak havoc on avocados, grapefruits. And all those areas in green are essentially areas that we've decided or evaluated as being potentially threatened by this pest. And so our project was to essentially come up with a new unmanned aircraft or drone application in order to spray baits for these particular pests. So in the video here, we were conducting a test of could we actually apply our pesticides. So when you see these small droplets coming out of the bottom of the aircraft, these are a bait application. So this is a formula called Spinosa, which is an organic pesticide. Essentially what it is, it will draw in all of these Mexican fruit flies, drive them away from our grapefruit or oranges, and then kill them at that point. And so we were trying to invest in this particular way of doing it, since currently what we have to do is have ATVs driving up and down these roads at about 25 miles an hour, which isn't particularly safe for them to do. So by doing this, we are able to remove the threat to the humans having to be out there in the fields. And as you can see from some of these, it definitely works. We were able to capture some flies even while we're still trying to collect leaves off the trees. And so one of the other major projects I have to work on is control for grasshopper and Mormon cricket. So these little guys will thrive throughout the western United States. And essentially what they do is they will inhabit lots of different types of grasslands, swarm, and then they will cover roads, buildings, and just make a hazard for anyone who's trying to get out there. And what we normally do is have locally contracted agricultural pilots who then spray pesticides in all those rangeland areas. And they wanted to do something a little different this year in that they wanted to switch from the nozzle on the right side, which is what we've been doing for the past 40 years, to the nozzle on that left side. And the primary reason for that is you can see on there, there's multiple nozzle tips. So that allows these agricultural pilots to essentially be able to just turn that nozzle head, and they'll be able to spray a completely different chemical. So that means they won't have to pull all of these nozzles off after they've finished spraying in the morning, so they can go out and spray something else in the afternoon, which is a much better economic advantage for them. So as part of it, I basically need to prove that switching to this new nozzle wouldn't have any negative impacts on those applications. So what I start off with is essentially simulating what the airflow is across that entire wing surface area, and then simulate the airflow around the nozzle itself. And you can see that we were testing this in a couple of different orientations to see how that would impact these droplets that are coming off of these nozzles. And then after that, we conduct some of our tests. So we have our pilots flying through, and we have a bunch of nice runways we can use for testing. And then he flies over and performs that spray application. And if you can see that line of orange cones there, so essentially what we're doing there is we're using those small yellow pieces of paper on that side, which are water sensitive, in order to collect some of the droplets that are landing on them. And those will look like that image on the left. And part of my job was essentially to write a computer program in order to identify each of those droplets, and calculate how large they are. And we then take that information in order to calculate where that chemical is being applied throughout that range of cones, so that we can determine whether or not the shape of that distribution is what we need in order to apply that in the field. And that's to allow us to be able to apply these pesticides in both a safe and environmentally friendly way. So those are just two of the projects that I'm currently working on. So probably the other question you want to ask is, how did I get here? So right now I'm working in Texas, but I started off in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where I attended the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And yes, that is how you pronounce it. And so while I was there, I got pretty much all of my degrees, my Bachelor of Science, Master's, and PhD, all in what they call it biological engineering, but really is agricultural engineering. And so the nice thing about studying agriculture in Hawaii is that it looks something a little more like this. So we have over here some flooded taro and rice fields that are basically in the shadow of some very beautiful rainforests. So I got used to working outdoors in beautiful vistas pretty much throughout all of my undergraduate. And then when I started my master's degree, I got to go on some excursions in helicopters, where we were essentially trying to kill invasive plants by shooting them with paintball guns, with paintballs filled with herbicides. And that is where I first got my passion for flying. So essentially we'd go out probably every 2 months and just fly around the eastern portions of Maui looking for these invasive plants. And so after that, I got hooked on flying and I learned to fly myself. So I didn't learn to fly helicopters, I prefer airplanes. But that also meant flying around some of the most beautiful areas. So this is particularly on the island of Molokai. So basically, I've learned that aviation was going to be a significant part of my life throughout that. And then after all of that, I then started teaching at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. So at first, I was teaching primarily unmanned aircraft, so essentially showing people how to first off get their licenses, and then some of the basic sciences on data that they could collect with those. And during that teaching excursion, I got to do something that was completely different from the normal agricultural jobs that I'm used to. So in 2018, we had a massive volcanic eruption on the volcano Kilauea. So that was all the way back on May 3rd was when we had our first earthquakes. And then we actually had several cracks start breaking up along different parts of these roads that we were working on. And that's a big deal in Hawaii because there are a lot of areas that have exactly one road going in and out. And then on May 4th, we had the very first fissure open. And then on May 5th, we got the call at the university that the civil defense wanted us to go out and be able to track the course of this volcanic eruption. So our program at the University of Hawaii at Hilo had actually flown over a lot of eruptions back in 2016 during the Pahoa eruption, so we had some experience doing that. And so the nice thing about doing these emergency flights is you essentially get to fly without boundaries. So we were able to break all of the rules, flying in what we call a TFR, a temporary flight restriction, meaning that normal aircraft couldn't be there. It was just relief aircraft. We could fly all the way up to 1,000 feet. Normally you're stuck at about 400, and we could fly at night. And so we did all those things. So flying all the way at 1,000 feet over a lot of these volcanoes, flying at night over some of the areas that were on fire in order to track the progress of the lava throughout that eruption. And so we do that occasionally with thermal images. So here we have fissure number 22 on the right side and 21 on the left side. And it's a little difficult to get the sense of scale that's associated with that, but that plume that you just saw was molten rock being propelled in the air about 2,000 feet. And then more than just the thermal is, we would occasionally have RGB and thermal. So this is from the flight that we conducted to basically declare that the volcano had stopped erupting. So you can see on the right side there, we have our thermal video, and that red area was a hotspot that we were looking at and trying to investigate. So we're able to see on the RGB imagery on the left side that that was essentially just where a portion of the crater had collapsed. So that was the hottest area. And we're essentially seeing that none of the lava was currently moving. All of it was stationary where it was, even though it was still hot. That essentially meant that the volcano had stopped erupting. And then so one thing to remember during that eruption was, if you can see all the lines there, those are all roads that are a part of a neighborhood. So this volcano was erupting in the middle of this 5th largest neighborhood we had on the Big Island. So this is the progress from the very first night, second night, third night, and fourth night. So you can see how we got quite a few different areas of active lava flows throughout even just the first 4 days. And what we would essentially do with that data is pull it in and draw polygons around where all the hottest areas were. And in that way, we could basically track the progress of that lava it was moving through. And what we used a lot of that data for was essentially advising fire department, police department, emergency services, what areas were still being actively destroyed, what areas people could go into and try and get some of their belongings, their pets that they had to leave behind. And so that is what I do and how I got here. So at this point, I am certainly happy to take any questions from you guys.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. If anyone has a question, if you can please submit those in the chat box. So I'll give everyone just a few minutes in case anyone has any questions. Okay, we have a question, and I'm not sure if, I think we can answer this in a separate chat. I don't think it's for Dr. Rodriguez, but we do have one actually. This is from Robin. What kind of weight limit do you expect drones can carry for pesticide applications?
Okay, so right now the legal limit for flights under what we call Part 107, which is the FAA regulations for small unmanned aircraft, is 55 pounds maximum. So the maximum that I'm currently seeing on the market is about 25 pounds of pesticides. That said, there are currently exemptions for that, which are used for agriculture, which do allow aircraft exceeding that limit. So I think the maximum that we're seeing under current FAA rules is about 100 pounds of chemical being applied.
Okay, we have another question. Dr. Rodriguez, if you can tell us about your family, where you grew up, and what motivated you to seek a career in this field.
So I am an only child, and I grew up in the state of Florida. And I decided to go to the farthest extremes of the United States in order to get away from my family when I went to school. But as far as what motivated me, so I ended up actually growing up on a banana plantation during my youth. So I didn't quite get away from agriculture there. So that's probably why I started off in that field in Hawaii. And then the aviation part grew on me as I just kept going up in the air in helicopters and airplanes.
I think we have one more question. You can just, I think they're trying to type, but why did you decide to come work at USDA?
So I had been teaching at the university for quite a while, but essentially I wanted to do more than just teaching. So I really wanted to move more into using my skill sets in order to really try to help as many people as possible. That was one thing that I had learned during that eruption was I really got the most out of my work by helping other people. And the easiest way for me to do that was working with the USDA in that agricultural field. That was where my skill sets were, and that's where I could do the most good.
I know you're currently in Texas, in deep South Texas. How is this different from where you've been before, including Florida and Hawaii, and how are you adjusting?
So I've had to adjust in terms of I am not 5 minutes away from the beach anymore. I don't have a mountain to climb anymore, so I think the highest point, at least in the area I am, is only about 212 feet, so it's not quite that much. But so the nice thing here is that flying is still pretty easy. It's fairly cheap, so I try and be in the air as much as I can. Not used to winter in Florida and Hawaii. We didn't really have that, and even though it is South Texas, it still gets much colder than I have ever been used to.
Interesting. So what is next in your career journey?
So at least at the moment, I am currently managing most of our unmanned aircraft projects for S&T. So I imagine that will most likely springboard into just heading most of the unmanned aircraft portions. So right now we're essentially expanding our fleet out. So I'll mostly be doing a lot of training of some of our new pilots in field ops and S&T and other areas, as well as developing some of the guiding policies that we have there. So the nice thing about being in a brand new field is that essentially we're shaping it to be whatever we want it, so I can take the reins as much as I'd like to at the moment.
Okay, we have another question. Will application by drone be best suited for dry applications like spinosad seemingly, or can it eventually move towards fluid applications?
So the Spinosa actually is a liquid application, so there's just very large droplets that look like granules. So currently we are working with both granular and liquid applications. The liquid application is actually the easier one at the moment. Let's see what else. So right now the biggest problem we're having is the vast majority of manufacturers for drones for aerial application are out of China. And in China, they have very small farms. They're looking at only in the 10s, 20s of acres, whereas in the US, we're averaging a good 500, 600 acres per farm. That's really where we're seeing the problems right now, is that they're just not making these quite big enough the size that we need for to really make a dent in agriculture in the U.S.
And a follow-up question to that is, why is liquid easier?
So at least at the moment, the pumps and the application systems are all being essentially pulled over from micro irrigation setups for smaller greenhouses. So all that technology was really already on the market. Whereas for granular application, the devices that are currently used on airplanes and on helicopters don't size down very well. So that particular area, there's only about 2 manufacturers, one in Canada and one in Taiwan, that make off-the-shelf versions for those granular applications for drones right now. So that's the main reason it's easier. It's not so much that it's technically easier, it's that the manufacturers just aren't there with the technology infrastructure yet.
Okay. Any advice for students as they are getting ready to pursue careers in STEM and agriculture?
Well, I'm going to have to speak more to my journey than anyone else's, but I found that basically was the activities that I did outside of the primary curriculum that drove my career path. So learning to fly, learning basically going up in the air for all those things, that was not part of any of my coursework. That was all extra stuff that I wanted to do. So really, that's kind of my best advice, is take advantage of the time while you're in college to do a whole bunch of different things that you will probably not get the opportunity to do so in the rest of your life.
I think that answers the second part of that question, which was what can students be doing while in college to be competitive upon graduation? Do you have anything else to add, or?
Well, I can also speak particularly for engineers. For a lot of agricultural engineers, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, you end up actually spending a lot of your time on different areas of competition. So in agriculture, we actually had a lot of field robotics competitions that were intercollegiate. So University of Hawaii competed against Nebraska, Iowa, Ohio, state universities, essentially designing robots to perform some task, and there would be a competition every single year. So being involved in those kinds of activities really drives you so that you're not just competing with the engineers at your university, you're competing with a lot of others. And I always found that I thrived on competition. I find most engineers thrive on competition, of having that extra goal there, more than just trying to graduate, of having to compete to be the best, or at least do the best you can. And that just made the journey that much better.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. If anyone has any other questions, you can submit them in the chat box. We're going to move on to our next presenter, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Julio Puentes, who will introduce him. Julio?
Yes, hi. Thank you, Ruby. Good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to confirm, Michael, are you on and ready to go?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. There you are. All right. So our next speaker is Michael Rizzo. I can see Mike has already logged on to his camera, and Mike comes to us from the United States Forest Service. He is a program specialist for the Office of International Programs, located here in my hometown, also of Chicago, Illinois. And with that, Michael, take it away.
All right, I just want to confirm everybody can see my opening slide.
Yes, I think it's your contact information, right?
Perfect. I just want to make sure everybody can see it. So, well, good afternoon, everybody. I joined in a little late, and hopefully I'm working from home like everybody else, so you might see my little one come and show you a toy to the camera. It's pretty common these days where we're sheltering in place, but thanks for the introduction, Julio, and thank you to my USDA colleagues for the invitation. So my name is Michael Rizzo. I work with the Office of International Programs of the U.S. Forest Service. So I think, and I'm going to get it a little bit on my background. I'm going to do a little different than Roberto did, where he showed his educational trajectory. I'll start with that, tell folks how I arrived at the Forest Service, what my positions were, and what I'm doing now in the International Programs Office. And I'm happy to answer any questions during this presentation and do any follow-up activities as well. And as Julio mentioned, I'm based here in Chicago. So let me make sure I'm getting my slides. Perfect. So education, I graduated from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I actually started in chemistry, and as I told folks in a different presentation, I was kindly escorted out of the chemical department by the dean of chemistry because I was failing out of calculus and physics, and I just didn't have the background. I wasn't prepared for that coursework where I grew up in Chicago. But as more out of interest, I was taking anthropology courses and geography courses, never thinking I could make a living at it. But I ended up switching majors. I graduated in '93, and actually started my career as an archaeologist working in Mexico. And me, in my younger days, working in Mexico, I lived in Mexico during the '90s, which was really nice. Depending on where I worked, I was able to visit family on the weekends. And so it was really nice. And that's what I did. And my second, I went to Arizona State University to get a master's degree. And so I finished there in anthropology as well. But after I graduated, trying to figure out, where to go. I was living in Arizona at the time, and for some family reasons, I had to come back to Chicago. Well, I was in the right place at the right time. There was a new Forest Service unit called Midewin National Tallgrass Prairie. So I applied and I started in the Forest Service. For folks who don't know, we're one of the larger, if not the largest agency within the USDA. Just by fact, we're the second largest land management agency in the US. So we have some 35,000 employees in a variety of fields doing everything from forestry. You could be a business, an accountant, project manager. We do work closely with APHIS and the other USDAs, but the map you see here, all the green areas are national forest. Yellow, it's hard to see on the slide, but are national grasslands. So we are throughout the US. What's nice is you could actually move around a lot within the agency. You could switch to a different forest, a different office, and that sort of thing. But so what do? I mentioned we're one of the largest land management agencies. A lot of folks mistake us for the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service, but no, we're the Forest Service. We're part of the USDA. What sets us apart from many of the Department of Interior agencies, we have different philosophy. We're multi-use. Yes, timber is still cut, but it's still, there's recreation, there's research. We have some, about 175 national forest units, 193 million acres, including Puerto Rico, Alaska, Hawaii. We work out there as well. But so that's the agency. But I started working on a grassland, a national tallgrass prairie located here in Illinois. I was hired as an archaeologist originally, just based on my background in anthropology. But as I started, what I love about working with the U.S. Forest Service, I have a very short attention span. And so while doing archaeology, I had interest in a lot of other areas. So working out there, I was also involved very heavily in habitat and ecological restoration. This prairie actually was a former military installation, an arsenal. So we were cleaning it up, everything from unexploded ordnance to hazardous waste, and it's a super fun site. So we're converting it back into prairie for use by wildlife, especially birds, but also people. And you see in this photo, there's people here. It's a large piece of public land that can be enjoyed by people in Illinois, but also, trails, recreation, and that sort of thing. So it was really nice. I'm working on this team, but I'm also able to get involved with all of these other projects. And another part of the Forest Service, and this is how most of the people in the country know us, is wildland fire suppression. And you typically see them, right now the fires are northern Arizona, southern Utah, probably northern New Mexico. And it's very cyclical. And then it'll start up in June in Colorado, Wyoming, and make it, eventually by October, you'll see a lot of fires in California. And that's a natural cycle. What's interesting, the Forest Service, we have a lot of expertise in fire suppression. We work with our counterparts in other agencies at different levels. This is a big part of my job now, and the majority of my job is focused on monarchs at this point. And I think everybody knows, but for those who don't know, the eastern monarch butterfly migrates between Mexico and Canada. So they literally just arrived to Chicago last week. Involved in conservation, the outdoors, and really, the cultural symbolism really worked well. It's a symbol for the dreamers, for DACA, but families, if working with monarchs, it was a way of really tying things together. And habitat works for birds, it works for people, and works for monarchs. And so this is what my job became as I was working on the grassland. It turned out that the Forest Service has an office called International Programs, and International Programs works in, depending on the day of the week, some 90 to 100 countries around the world. There's a Latin America team, Africa and Middle East team, Asia, Russia and Eastern Europe, and a lot of it is in conjunction with the State Department, U.S. Agency for Canada. Yeah, I'm definitely going to go there. And my family's from Michoacan, so it's amazing. So I'm doing these temporary assignments, and a job opened up. And then I applied into the International Programs Office for a program called Wings Across the Americas, Alas en las Americas. And it's a program that focuses on migratory birds, monarch butterflies, bats, and even dragonflies. And there's research, habitat, investigations, but outreach and public engagement is a big part of it. So I applied in, so this is my job right now. I manage projects throughout the hemisphere for habitat and engagement with people. From our standpoint, I could do the best habitat project in the world, but if people are not involved, we need people who are going to respect it, maintain it, help us. And it isn't just the Forest Service. We have partnerships throughout the Americas doing it. And the way to think about it, because I do get these questions, why should I pay, as a taxpayer, pay for work in Brazil or Mexico or Nicaragua? And you got to look at these as strategic investments. So if the Forest Service is using taxpayer money to invest in a habitat project on, say, in Texas or Illinois, and then these birds, these butterflies fly away, they go to Latin America, but they don't come back. And so we have to invest at strategic habitat conservation sites along the flyways. So for shorebirds, for example, we work from Alaska all the way down the Pacific coast, all the way down to Chile, and then over to the Atlantic coast in Argentina for the same birds. And it's strategic points to, and it's leveraging funds between partners. It isn't just the US government, it's foreign governments, nonprofits. So that's a huge part of what I do, is managing these projects. But my heart is still at doing community engagement. So I work with a lot of conservation organizations along the Flyway. Yes, government agencies, but organizations. It could be something as small as a school, but it could be larger groups, the Nature Conservancy, for example. But there's groups in Latin America and the United States that help us coordinate efforts and really get people involved. And so this is a big part of what I do. These photos, yes, they're beautiful. These are the Monarch Reserve. I don't get to get out there every day. You know, the photos are a little bit misleading in that. So I'm not under, these are monarch butterflies on the tree in the reserve. A lot of times I'm in front of the computer coordinating stuff, and I'm on the phone like my colleagues from the USDA here. It's just, that's a big part of it. So who do I work with? The bulk of my work is focused on community-based organizations. And the photos here, these are down in central Mexico. And it isn't just about, you know, save the birds, save the butterflies, and that sort of thing. I think of myself as a bridge between the scientific world and communities. A lot of times, my colleagues, you know, you must do this. You got to plant trees, quit cutting the trees. And for example, in central Mexico, the campesinos would tell me, Mike, we can't eat butterflies. How do we make a living? And so I look for strategies that allow people to make a living, but at the same time work for conservation. It's not easy. There's a lot of discussions that happen, a lot of stakeholders. As one of my colleagues in central Mexico says, conservation without dollars is conversation. So it's really harnessing these resources out there, whether it's Forest Service, USDA, State Department, and leveraging them with other partners to make these, like in this case here, nurseries. The top photo is a nursery for a fir tree called Oyamel, where the monarchs overwinter. And then there's mixing soil and erosion control. So there's a lot of stuff there. And what we do there, you know, we're working on traditional agriculture as well. Folks are able to grow crops that they could sell in the market, but also make sure that they can feed their families. That's a big part of what we do, and keep people tied to the land. You know, in the news, you know, people, you know, all the people make it seem like everybody wants to immigrate out. And so we work with a lot of organizations to keep people tied to the land. They want to stay tied to the land, but they need to be able to make a living. And then from our case, it also has to work with conservation. There's a map of the Flyway. So I work along the Flyway. There's research involved there in the bottom, but it could be a school group. And so we tie in all of these partnerships, all of these projects together. And with our partners, we coordinate activities throughout North America for monarchs. Here, you know, just see some newsletters. This is stuff happening in Mexico. It can be a simple outreach activity for a school child, but also for organizations. And a lot of it is getting people talking. I saw a question a little earlier saying, you know, how can we best prepare, for example, what Roberto does as an engineer, or, you know, for what I do as an anthropologist, or for just working in the USDA, learning how to communicate and honing your communication skills is something I encourage all of you to do. Whether it's writing, it's speaking, public speaking is a huge thing. Listening is a big part of it. When I'm working with the stakeholders, what do they want? It's easy for me to come in as either a government official or a representative of conservation and say, we need this, we need this, we need this, when a big part of my job is simply listening. Sometimes a farmer, sometimes a partner organization, they just want to vent. You know, we're frustrated. We can't make a living doing this. You guys want us to do it. All right, so this is the issue. My kids can't go to school, or we can't do this. And a lot of times, and then we try to bring in other partners can help satisfy some of these needs. So communication is key, listening is key. Besides monarchs, I did mention birds. I'm heavily involved with migratory bird conservation throughout the Americas, from Alaska to Argentina. For the USDA Forest Service, I've had the good fortune of also working in the Middle East and North Africa for migratory bird conservation. Exact same thing, working with partners, getting them involved. What do the stakeholders want? What does the person at the community level want? It isn't just about what a government agency or a conservation organization wants. It's tying all this together. So this is a big part of what I do, is migratory bird conservation. And then now these are just kind of more comical pictures of a freight train in a utility box. But right now we're doing a lot with urban bird conservation, monarchs also, but there's a large rural to urban migration, not only in the US, but around the world. So we're trying to keep people tied to the land, keep our programs relevant. And we find that a lot of parents are happy, say they grew up on a farm, they want their kids. You know, it could be something as simple as a community garden box, a restoration plot in a city park. And what I'm doing is influencing we're really working to influence conservation, as I mentioned, along these flyways. So besides just me as a USDA person telling folks, we work with families and get them communicating the conservation messages. In Chicago, we work a lot. Chicago, after Los Angeles, has the second largest population of Mexican American after Los Angeles. And Julio, you'll probably correct my figures, but 1 million to 1.5 million in the region if you go from Milwaukee all the way around into Indiana. And so a lot of the families come from rural areas where we're also active as a Forest Service employee in projects. So we also send messages back to home communities through families saying, simple conservation messages with water, soil, air quality, plants. And the idea is family typically listen to other family members. As a government employee, I don't care where you're at in the world, if I go to tell someone to do something, like, yeah, whatever, dude, you work for the government, who cares? But if it's your brother, your sister, your compadre, your comadre, I mean, we work with everybody, and we affectionately call some of our projects the compadre effect, the comadre effect, because with social media these days, there's a lot of conversation going, hey, you're raising monarch butterflies, or hey, you're doing this. What are you doing it for? I'm dealing with birds. Oh, you could do this in Mexico. You could do this in other countries. So we do a lot of work that way with that communication. And a lot of it's informal in communication strategies through social media. So kind of closing out so we get to Q&A, kind of generalizing what I do a bit with projects. So I'm not going to go into detail with every project that I'm involved with, but I'm very interested right now in strengthening individuals. So I've been at the Forest Service now almost 20 years. I'm heavily involved with partnerships. So in the photo here is just 3 of the people I work with. Refugio and Karina are here in Chicago, and Tatiana's in Mexico. So they're newer in their career. They're not new, but they're newer. So I'm doing a lot of mentorship. And I look at it as a way of giving back. I've been mentored all the way from elementary school, if I look at it that way, but especially in university and the USDA, people helping me along the way, giving me great advice. And so I'm really helping people, helping them position themselves to become really strong. In this case, these are all bird conservation specialists. Audubon Great Lakes, and then Conavio is the equivalent of U.S. Fish and Wildlife in Mexico. So we coordinate our partnerships, but also, we bounce ideas off one another, and I give them a lot of career path advice. And then what does that lead to? I'm very interested in strengthening organizations, whether in the US or Latin America. Leadership, communication, strategic thinking. This is what I want all of you as students to start thinking about. Yes, be strategic with your coursework, but if you do have an elective you could take, think about trying something new. I can't emphasize enough the communication side, and then ultimately all of this leads to leadership. So this is a huge part of what I'm doing in Mexico right now, is strengthening organizations so they can maintain projects that they're working. They can work with the public. I actually take a very behind the scenes approach, even keeping the Forest Service logo, the USDA logo off at times to let an organization shine. And we network together. And then some of the projects, we're looking at youth development in the state of Hidalgo, state of Mexico, and Chiapas. We're doing a lot in Latin America right now with gender equity, training. We have the female firefighters of the Forest Service training female firefighters in Mexico, Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. And it's really giving people opportunities. It isn't just the one class, one course is going to do it. You really got to think of the big picture, and that's where the strategy comes in there. Strengthening people and organizations. Ultimately, that strengthens conservation. This photo's is actually in Chihuahua, which is probably a couple hours south of El Paso near Casas Grandes, a big area for grassland birds. But the same thing, strengthening people. Here we're strengthening ranchers and people in the towns there. But ultimately, this is all about strengthening communities. It's strengthening conservation, but it's strengthening community, strengthening people. So that's my job.
Mike, I think we may have lost you. I don't know if you can still hear us. Mike, I think we got you back. I see you.
Perfect. Did I make it to that last slide? With strengthening communities, I hope everybody heard it.
I think you cut out right about then.
All right, and so, just kind of what I was saying, folks, all the strengthening people, strengthening organizations, within the context of my work, it's about strengthening conservation, but ultimately it's about strengthening people, strengthening communities, and that's what it's about, strengthening communities, in my case, throughout the Americas. So we're working together, and people are and really building self-sufficiency. So that's a big part of what I do. In a lot of ways, I'm using butterflies, birds, habitat to reach those goals. So I'm happy to take any questions folks have, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much for taking your time to share your story with us, telling us what the work that you do and your work within communities. We'll give it a few minutes to type for audience members to type in some questions. I know we already have a couple there, but the first one that I want to start out with was, how has your job changed due to the current pandemic? Has it impacted your ability to track or engage with migratory bird activities?
So yeah, the pandemic, the team I work with, we're very much interested. The face-to-face interaction is key with relationship building. So everything's virtual now, whether it's GoTo, Zoom, there's so many platforms. Yes, we do a lot by telephone, but the face-to-face interaction is very tough. So we have colleagues that literally fly to countries throughout the Americas. I get out internationally, not as much as most. I'm doing a lot from home, but I have partnerships in the US that I get out to. So we canceled all of our face-to-face interaction. But what's nice though, when I look at my partnership, it's like you're dealing with family. When we talk on the phone, we always ask about how family's doing, how are your children, is everyone okay, everyone's well. So we end up talking about that, and it's a conversation starter. We're all in the same boat. All of our partners in the Americas, some of them are doing field work in limited capacity, but in Mexico, I was in, same thing, shelter in place. In Colombia, they're same thing, everybody's working virtually. So I don't think the birds really noticed, but it's having an impact on us, one, communicating, field work, and then frankly, the economic impact is going to have a huge negative impact on resources going to nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations. So we're trying to plan ahead now, knowing that in 2021, there's going to be a lot of less funding going to our partners. And there's unknowns within the government too for us, but we're trying to place resources to maximize our impact. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Mike. We had a question from Gabriela Cavazos. I think it was asked and answered in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and just ask it anyway. But how can we learn more about conservation and volunteer and interning with USDA? I'll just go ahead and mention that my colleague Tori did mention in the chat box that we do have a great website called www.usda.gov/youth that speaks a lot to those opportunities. Specifically also with internships, with our program called Pathways that's open to all the federal government. Also links to third-party internship organizations that we work with, volunteer opportunities, and specifically with the Forest Service. Mike, do you want to add anything, perhaps any opportunities with working with your partners in conservation areas?
Yeah, definitely. So pretty much the majority of the national forests, if you live near a national forest or national grassland, you can call their visitor center, and most have active volunteer projects. So and anything from habitat to recreation to the front desk, because there's a lot of opportunities to gain experience. With our partner organizations, depending where you're at, a lot of times they also have volunteer opportunities for monitoring. It could be a museum, it could be like a nature conservancy, the wetlands initiative, those sort of things. but they also at times also hire for internships. And so the USDA website will have Forest Service internships included, but you also just might want to volunteer to get your face out there so they know who you are and put a face to a name.
Perfect, great advice. Another question from Tori was what was one of the hardest career lessons you had to learn?
The hardest career lessons that I had to learn, I've been through state, before I joined the Forest Service, I graduated with a master's degree in anthropology, and then what's next? And I really had to make it into what I'm doing now, because I wasn't living in Arizona, I wasn't making a lot of money as an archaeologist. In terms of archaeology, if you don't work for a government agency or a museum, a university, it's really difficult to make a career out of it. And the Forest Service, I was able to make it. But there's been some, I would say at times, the most challenging are ethical dilemmas. Are you doing the right thing? There's challenges within your resource, meaning, and for us, the jargon we use is our resource. I was in charge of cultural resources. There's biological resources, wildlife, that sort of thing. And sometimes there's a conflicting message, and what's the priority, what's the mission of the particular project? So I've seen historic properties destroyed in favor of habitat for birds, and there's some ethical dilemmas there. And working overseas, seeing partners, I'd say some of the ethical dilemmas I've seen is seeing partners not treating the public properly and pulling the plug in a partnership. If it's not true to my heart and to my ideals, I don't want to work with that organization. So I've ended partnerships for that reason. So those are some of the challenges, both work-wise with the resource, but also on the human side. If I see somebody, I don't care how popular they are, how connected they are, I will pull the plug in a partnership if I think that they're compromising ethics or not treating the public properly.
I wanted to go back to a question that was asked of Dr. Rodriguez, but I think it's also relevant. It was asked by Marco Trevino. What suggestions do you have for college students preparing for careers? What can they be doing while they're in college to be competitive upon graduation?
Well, I thought Roberto answered the question very well. What I would add on to it is, as I mentioned, the communication side, honing your writing skills, honing your communication side. And I've seen this within the Forest Service. We could have the smartest individual at the table with us, but if they can't communicate internally, say leadership to sell their projects, but also to the public. By the internal side, I've had that. How come your project got funded? Well, I communicated it properly to the management, the people managing the money when I was starting out. I got asked when I started, why did you get to go to Mexico? Well, I proposed a project and international programs decided to fund me to go. And so that's a big part of it. So communications, taking risks, especially when you're younger. This is the time to explore project ideas, an internship. An internship, for example, it's not only for the agency to evaluate you as a permanent employee, it's for you to evaluate us. You might not want to work for the USDA. You might not want to work for the Forest Service. So I'd say that communications classes, internships, and meeting people. And for the folks on the line in high school and even college, find a mentor, find a teacher, find a college professor, because they're the ones who will advise you along the way. They helped me out tremendously. Don't take this course, take this course. They know you when it comes time, say if you decide to go to graduate school and you need a reference. Well, you've met these people, they know you, they know your coursework, they could comfortably write about you. I found a mentor when I went to University of Illinois my first year, and I would go talk to him in his office hours all 4 years. I was fascinated. He was working in Mexico and advised me properly. And the next thing you know, I was sent to Mexico a week after I graduated my undergraduate to work. And so stuff like that. Communications, risk-taking, find a mentor.
Thank you, Michael. So we have a few more minutes. Time's almost coming to an end. So the last question I'll ask you then is, what's next in your career journey?
Oh, that's a tough one. But, I get this, where do you expect to see yourself in 5 years? I can't predict that because then I'm not considering all the options. But where I'm at now, I've really shifted focus on my work to really strengthening organizations, realizing that funding is very tight for everybody. And so by building, we say building capacity, by building their skill sets, they can communicate exactly that, communicate about their work properly to diversify their funding sources. So that's a big, it's almost an indirect way to influence conservation. It isn't just putting plants in the ground, planting trees, which I am involved with, but it's really strengthening these organizations. So that's where I see myself moving my work over the next 5 years, and that's where I'll be, if that makes any sense.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. All right. With that, I'll turn it back to Tori. Tori, are you on? All right, looks like we're having some technical difficulties, but with that, I want to thank again our speakers joining us today, Dr. Rodriguez and Michael Rizzo. We greatly appreciate your time, sharing your story, sharing with us what you do. I also want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed today's presentation. I said this is part of our monthly speaker series. Be on the lookout for additional speaker series in the upcoming weeks. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you all. Have a good day.